On June 21, 1978, 22-year-old Carla Brown was found brutally murdered in the basement of her home. It looked as if the killer had committed the perfect crime. And police could find very little evidence. But years later, investigators noticed something on a crime scene photograph that had previously been overlooked. The killer had left behind a clue. 22-year-old Carla Brown and her fiancé, a man we'll call Mark Hart, had recently purchased a home together in Wood River, Illinois. Although the couple had a rocky past, friends and family saw this as the beginning of a new phase in their relationship.
Carla Brown was a beautiful little girl, grew up into a beautiful young woman, was very popular in her hometown in the Wood River area, had taken some college classes, had been a high school cheerleader, was one of those girls that everybody knew. Girls liked her, guys liked her. She was just one of those people that was special, and everybody recognized that.
On June 21st, Carla Brown took the day off from work to unpack.
Yes, the house is great.
And spoke to one of her friends on the telephone.
Maybe we can have you over for dinner.
They had talked for a few minutes. In fact, we were even talking about getting together later on that afternoon.
Wait a second, I just heard something at the door.
And Carla interrupted the conversation and said, "Listen, I'll have to call you back. I'll see you later. There's somebody at the door." And that was the last that her friend ever talked to her.
Around 5:30 that afternoon, Carla's fiancé and his friend stopped by the house after work. When they walked into the basement, they saw a horrible sight. Carla was lying face down in a bucket of water.
She had her hands tied behind her. There was evidence of struggle, a death struggle in the basement, and a very strong suggestion of a sexual rape.
But investigators were confused about some of the things they saw. There were two men's socks tied around Carla's neck. They were tied neatly, inconsistent with what you would expect to see in a life and death struggle. The white electrical cord used to tie the victim's hands was not tight enough to effectively restrain an individual during an assault.
There was too much length of cord behind her to where her hands could come up in front of her. It would seem like to me that she would have access to the attacker, given that much freedom with the length of rope that was tied between the two wrists.
She was found wearing a sweater her fiancé said she would never wear in the summer. The top button was fastened, another inconsistency with a life and death struggle. The socks around Carla's neck were from inside the home. The mate to one was found in her fiancé's dresser. The other was under the sofa in the adjacent room. Under the sofa was a puddle of water tinted with blood. The sofa cushions were also wet, and there were blood drops on the floor near the sofa. In the rafters was a coffee carafe from the kitchen. To homicide investigators, it looked as if the coffee carafe had been used to rinse blood from the sofa cushions. The attack occurred near the sofa, and the body was later moved into an adjacent room and placed into the barrel of water. The crime scene staging told investigators that the perpetrator spent a great deal of time inside the house after the murder. But who knew that Carla Brown was home and alone on the day of the murder? And who would have felt free to spend so much time in the home cleaning up and staging the scene? Police began their investigation with a close look at Carla Brown's fiancé. The autopsy report on Carla Brown indicated death by strangulation. Although she was found nude from the waist down, there were no signs of sexual assault. Investigators were convinced that the killer spent a great deal of time in the house after the murder staging the crime scene.
I didn't know Mark very well, although they had dated for a number of years, off and on, and there were times in their relationship that it wasn't great, but she seemed to always be crazy about him anyway.
Police also questioned two neighbors who had been sitting in the yard next door on the day Carla and her fiancé were moving in.
Hey, Carla. Carla Brown. I'm John Pranty. We went to school together. Remember me?
Hi, how are you?
Both men had alibis as to where they were on the day of the murder, and they both willingly took lie detector tests and passed. With no other leads, police asked the FBI for a psychological profile of the killer and turned to FBI behavioral analyst John Douglas.
In my research, we began to break down crimes by disorganized and organized. Disorganized means extremely sloppy, carelessness on the part of the offender. The crime could be very, very impulsive. Organized means that there's a high degree and high level of criminal sophistication on the part of the subject.
To Douglas, this crime scene was disorganized, an indication that the killer was inexperienced and probably had never killed before. He came to the home with no intention of committing murder, but did so after some sort of confrontation or rejection. Since he spent so much time inside the home, Douglas believed that he was familiar with the victim and her routine and might be living in the neighborhood or very close by. Douglas said the killer was an unmarried white male in his mid to late 20s, high school educated, with a sloppy appearance. The use of electrical cord to tie the victim's hands indicated the killer had taken shop classes or had vocational training. Douglas also told investigators that they may have already interviewed the murderer and that he was capable of passing a polygraph test.
And then it got kind of spooky. I mean, I was sitting there and I wasn't sure I was believing what he was saying after a certain point. He started talking about how this individual would react and what kind of vehicle he'd be driving. And he started talking about a Volkswagen. There was a high probability this guy would be driving a Volkswagen, and that it would be red or orange in color.
This led investigators to focus once again on the two men sitting next door on the day Carla Brown and her fiancé were moving in. But investigators needed more than just a psychological profile. They needed hard evidence. Crime scene technician Alva Bush remained deeply troubled by the Carla Brown murder. For one thing, he and his colleagues could not determine what caused the wounds on Carla Brown's face and chin. The first real break in the case occurred when Bush attended a seminar on image enhancement at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Homer Campbell taught that seminar. He worked for the state of New Mexico as a medical investigator. Dr. Campbell was demonstrating a photographic technique that uses cameras, monitors, and computers to show details of crime scene photographs that cannot otherwise be seen.
This was a technique that had been used for several years, both by engineers in non-destructive testing of materials and also by archaeologists, looking at aerial photographs to find ancient ruins.
After the seminar, Bush told Dr. Campbell about the Carla Brown case.
And I said, "Doc, do I have a case for you?" And I told him about the Carla Brown case and that we were never able to identify what type of instrument had damaged her face.
I asked him to please send me the photographs that they had of the deceased person, and also to send me an autopsy report.
Dr. Campbell used his image enhancement equipment to look more closely at the crime scene photos of Carla Brown. The system not only improves the contrast of the photographs, but can also create what appear to be three-dimensional views, adding depth to the image. When Dr. Campbell was through, he knew what caused the injuries to Carla Brown's face.
He tells me that maybe the TV tray may have been the instrument that she was hitting the head with. This TV tray was lying on the floor within 3 foot of the victim, where she had probably been on the couch, but I had missed it.
The tray tables were still in storage, untouched in the 2 years since the murder. In an extraordinary piece of luck, Dr. Campbell found microscopic traces of blood and hair still present on the tray table. And what Dr. Campbell said next was even more revealing.
He says, "What about the bite mark?" And I said, "Bite mark? What bite mark? What are you talking about?"
When we looked at the photograph and went ahead and enhanced it and magnified it, present on the shoulder was a bite injury on the shoulder. And by looking at that bite injury, you could actually pick out individual teeth all the way across.
I mean, I'd trade that for 5 eyewitnesses anytime. So eyewitnesses can make mistakes, things like fingerprints don't. And it was my understanding that bite marks properly preserved with an identified defendant could give you the defendant as good as a fingerprint.
The killer had left behind a clue. All investigators needed now was a suspect. 2 years after the brutal murder of 22-year-old Carla Brown, investigators got the break they needed when a photographic enhancement revealed a bite mark on Carla's shoulder. Police now turned to the 2 men sitting in the yard next door when Carla Brown moved into her new home. Both matched the FBI's behavioral profile of the killer. Police checked their alibis again. Although both had passed the polygraph tests, police discovered that John Prantty had spoken about the murder to others.
John Prantty had mentioned to his friends that he had seen her body that day, that he had looked over the shoulder of some policemen while they were investigating in the basement, and he described the condition of her body, and he even mentioned that she had bite marks on her neck and collarbone.
The police were the only ones inside the house after Carla Brown's body was found.
And that was a shock to us as police officers, because there's no way that he could have known that unless he put the bite mark there. Also, the information about the location of the body, the way the body was found, the only way that that would have been known is either to have been there on the investigation or to have put the body there yourself, because we never released that information to the public or to the media.
Since the bite marks were overlooked during the original autopsy, investigators wanted to make sure nothing else was missed. So Carla Brown's body was exhumed for a second autopsy. This time, it was performed by Dr. Mary Case, the chief medical examiner for St. Louis County.
In the original autopsy, there was the ligature strangulation, and the body was examined, and for some reason the head was not examined. And so I opened the cranial cavity, and there was bruising in the scalp. Somebody struck her on the head. And question is whether or not, for example, this blow would cause loss of consciousness.
Dr. Case thought that Carla Brown may have been alive when she was placed in the barrel of water, because when she was found, there was foam around her mouth.
Because she was in water and she was producing that foam, I feel like there may be some component of drowning, that she was still, even though she'd been strangled, that she was still maybe to a minimal degree breathing, because I believe that she may have breathed in some water.
During the autopsy, more photographs were taken of the suspected bite wounds, which were sent to the New York State Police Forensic Unit for an independent evaluation. prosecutors wanted to make sure that the mark on Carla Brown's neck was, in fact, a bite wound.
In my opinion, the pattern injury on Carla Brown's neck had all the characteristics that a bite mark would have.
Dr. Levine was asked to compare the bite wound to 3 different dental casts prosecutors sent along for analysis. Dr. Levine had no idea to whom the casts belonged. After making wax impressions of the models, Dr. Levine concluded that 2 of the models were not consistent with the bite wound.
I took the 3rd model and examined all the individual characteristics that those teeth would have caused, compared those characteristics with the characteristics on the clarified photograph of Carla Brown's neck that I had, and came to the opinion that only that model was consistent with having caused that pattern injury or that bite mark.
He measured the teeth. He went back to the photograph. He turned them different ways. He held them up in the air. Finally, he laid the dental impressions on the table and he pointed to him and he said, "That's your man."
Model number 3 belonged to John Prantey. Interestingly, Prantey also matched John Douglas's psychological profile. He was in his late 20s, had a history of troubled relationships with women. He attended industrial art school and had a sloppy, unkempt appearance. Prantey spent a great deal of time in the neighborhood, often visiting his friend who lived next door to Carla Brown. And just as John Douglas had predicted, Prantey had passed an earlier polygraph test. The most unusual aspect of Douglas's profile was the prediction that Prantey would be driving a red Volkswagen.
Where that came from, only John could say. But in fact, it turned out that the individual did have a Volkswagen.
Prosecutors believe that when Carla Brown's fiancé left for work, John Prantey walked over and knocked on the door.
Maybe we can have you over for dinner.
Carla was talking on the telephone.
Yes, I understand. Hello? Wait a second, I just heard something at the door. Let me call you back. What do you want?
Need some help moving in?
I want you to leave.
Come on, mind if we talk a little?
I want you to leave now.
There was some kind of argument or struggle, possibly after she had rejected Prantey's sexual advances. He forced her into the basement and hit her with a tray table. At some point, he bit her on the shoulder and strangled her. Afterwards, he staged the scene to make it appear to be a sexual assault. But when he changed her clothes, he made the mistake of fastening the top button, the first clue that the scene had been staged. He tied her hands with electrical cord, wrapped the socks around her neck, and placed her into the water while she was unconscious but still alive. Prantey tried to remove the bloodstains on the sofa with water he carried from the kitchen and the coffee carafe, which he left in the rafters above the sofa. The clothes Carla was wearing that day were never found. Prantey may have taken them as a trophy. In July of 1983, John Prantey was tried and convicted of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 75 years in the state penitentiary. After 5 long years, Carla Brown's family finally had some closure.
I would like to tell him that he took away a very wonderful person who had a lot to offer and a family who cared very much about Carla, and that it was very, very selfish of him to not consider another person's life as something that can just be thrown away on a particular day.
He got caught because the techniques of investigation and law enforcement completely overpowered him. He got away with the crime because he was lucky. He got caught because law enforcement changed his luck.
Don Weber, along with journalist Charles Bosworth, chronicled the many ups and downs of this case in a best-selling book, Silent Witness.
Carla's family was so intrigued by the bite mark evidence that she embroidered a little tapestry that she presented to Don Weber as a token of her appreciation. And it offers the slogan that Don had used, that you can lie through your teeth, but your teeth don't lie. And around the border is the pattern of rectangle, space, triangle, which is the bite mark pattern that Don had proved had been made by John Prantty.
On the morning of February 20th, 1989, something terrible happened to Janice Johnson, a 35-year-old housewife and mother of 2 children.
Claire, I gotta go. I'll talk to you later, okay?
The investigation into that morning's events would raise questions that persist to this day. Clayton and Janice Johnson lived in the tiny coastal fishing village of Shelburne, Nova Scotia. It's a close-knit community where townspeople all know one another. For the Johnsons, Shelburne was the ideal place to raise their 2 young daughters, 11-year-old Darla and 9-year-old Dawn.
We had 2 lovely girls and, perfect as far as I was concerned. We were always together. Like, you can ask anybody around the community, whenever they've seen us, the 4 of us usually always together. Very, very rarely we ever went anywhere individually.
Clayton was an industrial arts teacher at the local high school. Janice was a homemaker. The Johnsons were a deeply religious family and very active in their church, volunteering much of their free time to church activities.
We were always out visiting people and doing this and that. My mom was the type of person that she didn't like to just sit around and do nothing, so we were always busy doing something. And we never went anywhere without doing it as a family.
The morning of February 20th, 1989 was a typical one for the Johnson family. After the children left for school, Clayton carried some laundry to the basement for his wife. Moments later, the telephone rang. Clayton answered on the basement extension.
And it was Claire Thompson, our next door neighbor. She wanted to answer. She took the phone. And I went out and got my coat and come back in and told her I was going to give her a kiss goodbye and left.
Really? Do you think your husband's got a mind?
I gotta go.
Okay, bye.
See you tonight.
Clayton then left for work, stopping along the way at a local gas station. A few minutes later, a neighbor stopped by the Johnsons' home. He discovered Janice at the bottom of the stairs. She was bloody and unconscious, but still alive. Clayton heard the news when he arrived at work and rushed to the hospital.
When I first seen her, I didn't recognize her because of like all the tubes and the swelling, so and I'd look almost twice to realize it was her. And it's just, I don't know, just one of those things that I want to see every day.
Janice had sustained severe head injuries from what was assumed to be an accidental fall down the basement steps. Despite the best of medical treatment, Janice died of her head wounds several hours later. She was just 35 years old.
I think it was the first time I ever seen my father cry. My first reaction was that it wasn't real. Like, you want to believe it didn't happen.
That's one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life, is to tell the two girls that their mother passed away.
The small community of Shelburne rallied around Clayton Johnson and his two daughters as they paid their last respects to a loving wife and mother. But that support soon crumbled when Clayton Johnson started dating a woman 30 years his junior. After Janice Johnson's death, the chief medical examiner, Dr. Roland Perry, performed an autopsy. He was hampered to some extent by the fact that there were no photographs of the accident scene. In a misguided effort to be helpful, two family friends had washed the blood from the basement before photographs could be taken. This is a police video shot later as the women described the blood stains. They said there was a small blood stain on the floor at the bottom of the steps, and a blood stain with bloody hair on the concrete wall next to the third step. This recreation shows the position of Janice Johnson's body when paramedics arrived. Her head was on the floor. Her leg was above her head on the step. In her left hand, she was holding her car keys. Although Dr. Perry found Janice Johnson's wounds to be unusual, he ruled the death a freak accident, concluding that she had fallen forward down the steps to her death. He suspected that her skull had become wedged in a 5.5-inch space between the wooden steps and the adjoining concrete wall, which crushed both sides of her head. When she landed on the concrete floor, she sustained the wound to the top of her head. Since Janice Johnson was thought to be in the house alone at the time of the incident, foul play was ruled out. Janice was on the telephone with Claire Thompson, who said she heard Clayton kiss Janice goodbye before leaving for work.
You think so? I don't know about that. Well, you better look for me.
Claire Thompson said they talked for 10 minutes and that the call ended around 7:50.
Oh, sure. Okay, talk to you then. Bye.
Witnesses saw Clayton Johnson at the gas station at the same time. A minute or two later, a neighbor found Janice in the basement and called paramedics. The call was logged in at 7:52.
That was, so to speak, the end of that. Of course, Clayton and his daughters had to deal with the great loss that they had suffered. It was only after some 18 months had passed that Clayton really made what might be called a dreadful mistake.
Clayton Johnson's mistake was to fall in love. Soon after Janice's death, Clayton started dating and later married 22-year-old Tina Waybritt. She was a member of the Johnsons' church and was 30 years his junior. In the close-knit conservative community of Shelburne, this new relationship raised a few eyebrows. Police also discovered that Clayton Johnson had purchased a $120,000 life insurance policy on Janice 2 months before she died. A background check revealed that Clayton Johnson was also having financial difficulties and that utility services were sometimes cut off in their home for non-payment.
And pretty soon, fact became confused with rumor, rumor with fact, and the more people talked, the more people wondered whether this lovable teddy bear Clayton Johnson was a wife killer.
So police decided to reopen their investigation into Janice Johnson's death. Homicide investigators went back to re-interview the woman who cleaned up the blood after Janice Johnson's death. To their surprise, 2 years later, one of the women recalled seeing more blood in the basement than she originally reported. On the walls, across the length of the floor, and on piles of lumber along the far wall. Investigators took this new information, along with the autopsy photos, to 2 of Canada's most respected pathologists. 3 years after his wife's death, Clayton Johnson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Johnson pleaded not guilty to the charge. Prosecutors introduced the new blood spatter testimony and also raised the issue of Johnson's new love interest.
Clayton Johnson was on trial for events that happened after the accident. He was on trial for the insurance monies that he collected. He was on trial for this new girlfriend that he had move in with him.
Clayton Johnson was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison.
I don't know how yet I stood up. I could feel my knees and everything get weak, and I took all my power was just to keep standing up, not falling down. It was a shock, I'll tell you.
Have you ever felt like you were reading a book? It's what it seemed like. It didn't seem like it could be happening in my life.
Johnson was ordered to serve his sentence in the Atlantic Maximum Security Institution. From there, he contacted the Association in Defense of the Wrongfully Convicted in Toronto. His story caught the attention of the director of the organization, James Lockyer.
As you go back through the miscarriages of justice in both our country, in Canada that is, in the United States and in England, very often, probably as often as 40 to 50% of the time, bad science has played a significant role in a wrongful conviction.
But the first thing Lockyer noticed wasn't just questionable science. It was a problem with the timeline. Claire Thompson said she was on the telephone with Janice Johnson on the morning of her death. In her original statement, Thompson said she heard Clayton kiss Janice goodbye at approximately 7:40. She said the call with Janice lasted 10 minutes until about 7:50. A witness said Clayton Johnson was at the gas station at the same time, 7:50, when Claire Thompson said she was ending her call to Janice. The neighbor found Janice's body and called paramedics at 7:52. Clayton was aware that Janice was expecting company that morning.
Any theory that he would kill his wife in a time span of seconds or minutes when he could legitimately expect 3 different people to show up at the house in that very time that he was supposedly assaulting his wife. You put all that together, the theory he killed his wife was, in my view, completely ridiculous.
Blood spatter expert Herb McDonald was also skeptical. He believes that the witness's original statements were probably the most accurate.
The neighbors at that time reported that the blood was consistent with an accident. Now, obviously, they're not qualified to interpret bloodstain patterns, but had they seen a lot of spattering, or if they'd seen blood up on the walls and ceiling, I think at that time, even though they were cleaning it up, they would have a clear recollection of what it looked like, and especially where they washed it up.
Another story that changed was Claire Thompson's. In her original statement, she said she called Janice around 7:40 and that the call lasted for 10 minutes. 2 years later, she said she may have called closer to 7:30. This created the window of opportunity for Johnson to have murdered his wife. James Lockyer asked 2 forensic pathologists to review the forensic evidence independently, Dr. Linda Norton of Dallas, Texas, and Dr. James Ferris of Vancouver. They both examined the case file and autopsy photos, and it was what they didn't see that they found most intriguing.
There are no defense wounds, and in a bludgeoning of this nature, considering the location of the head wounds, one would expect to see defensive wounds if this were an actual bludgeoning death.
During an attack, most individuals instinctively raise their hands to protect themselves. As a result, their hands and forearms sustain injuries.
There's absolutely no evidence that any of the injuries were as a result of some form of homicidal assault.
Janice Johnson's car keys were in her hand when paramedics arrived. The lack of arm wounds and the car keys also cast doubt on the original forensic report, which stated that Janice fell forwards down the steps.
What occurred is that she slipped at the top of the stairs and she fell backwards instead of forwards. And of course, most falls down the stairs are forward falls. Backward falls are uncommon, and I think that's what led to an awful lot of the misinterpretation that occurred in this case.
Clayton Johnson's new defense team now had 2 major hurdles. First, to prove to the court that Johnson was innocent, and also to show how Janice Johnson really died. By the time Clayton Johnson's new defense team gathered their information, he had spent 6 years behind bars. It was a life Johnson had no choice but to get used to.
It's a whole new ballgame as far as your change of lifestyle, the whole thing, you know, it's a rude awakening.
Johnson's team of forensic experts did not believe that his wife's injuries were consistent with a bludgeoning death, and they did not think that she had fallen forwards, as was originally reported. They believed that Janice had fallen backwards. To get Johnson's conviction overturned, his lawyers needed to find a way to show how the accident really happened. They turned to blood spatter expert Herb McDonald, but after studying the case file, McDonald couldn't figure out a way to recreate an accidental fall down the basement steps.
The very night that I was about ready to call James Lockyer and advise him that I could not do my recreation, and I've done many of these reconstructions or recreations, if you like, I was very disappointed, and I told him, I was about to tell him that I just couldn't do it. And that night I read the morning paper. I frequently don't read the paper until a day late. And on the front page, here's Peter Pan at West High School. And of course I thought, hey.
I'm flying, 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 quiet. Look at me way up high, suddenly, here am I'm flying.
In the production of the musical Peter Pan, various characters fly across the stage in a harness. McDonald called the high school, borrowed the transom and the operator, and hired a model the same height and weight as Janice Johnson. McDonald then built a replica of the Johnsons' basement steps. He videotaped the entire procedure and put blue chalk on the wall and step where witnesses saw the blood. With the model at the top of the steps, she fell backwards. When her head fell into the gap in between the third step and the concrete wall, the chalk marks on the model's head were consistent with the injuries found on Janice Johnson.
There's no question that that is a good explanation for how the wounds on Janet Johnson occurred over her right ear.
It's remarkable when you see it because the blue marks appear on the model's head exactly where the injuries are found on Janice's left and right temples.
James Lockyer believes that Janice Johnson was still on the telephone when Clayton was at the gas station.
And then what are you going to
And that the call ended at 7:50, just as her neighbor was arriving at the house.
do? You know, I've got to go. I'll talk to you later.
She grabbed her car keys, ran up the steps, and lost her footing. As she fell backwards, her head became wedged in the 5.5-inch gap between the step and the cement wall. Her feet pulled her head from the gap, flipping her body over onto the basement floor, producing the gash found on the top of her head. When all of this information came to light, Canadian prosecutors took the unusual step of releasing Clayton Johnson from prison. He had spent 6 years behind bars.
I'm just very happy to get back with my family. I'm very pleased with the decision of Justice Freeman, and I couldn't ask for a better legal team than what I've got. And I just want to get back with my family.
I'm really happy right now because that means my dad's actually going to see me graduate. I've got my father back in my life.
Although authorities have made no final decisions about the case, and there's always the chance of a retrial, many believe it will simply be dismissed. For a crime forensic experts say didn't happen, 6 years in prison is enough.
That's quite right, indeed. Clayton Johnson wasn't convicted of a murder that he didn't commit. He was convicted of a murder that never happened.
We've made an error, so once you recognize you've made an error, you do the best you can to rectify it. And the best way to rectify this case is simply to acquit this man, exonerate him, and let him go on with his life.
Well, I was given all different opinions as far as, the justice system is concerned. Because, I've always been brought up right from the time I could more or less walk around that, the police were your friend, that you held them on a certain level. And just after going through this, it makes you think twice.
In 1996, more than a dozen children in Seattle, Washington were seriously ill and fighting for their lives, all gripped by a mysterious illness. When one of the children died, officials feared more deaths would follow, and medical detectives frantically searched for the cause. Terry and Kelly Beverly both worked in the computer industry and have 2 children, a son, Michael, and a daughter, Bettina. After a leisurely day of playing in the woods, Michael complained of pain in his stomach. Later, he had uncontrolled diarrhea. When his diarrhea contained blood, his parents became alarmed.
He was just laying on the couch, just still, having bloody diapers every
every 30 minutes, and just very painful.
And it was just changing him, just looking at his little body was turning itself inside out.
The Beverleys took Michael to a hospital emergency room, where doctors discovered that his blood count had dropped to dangerous levels, his kidneys were failing, and life-threatening clots were forming in his blood.
Acute bloody diarrhea in an otherwise healthy child is an important medical problem, and physicians here and elsewhere work that up very aggressively, take that very seriously.
Michael's stool sample was sent to the laboratory for testing. Doctors were alarmed when they found a potentially deadly pathogen known as E. coli 0157. It's a bacteria usually found in the intestines of both humans and animals. When an individual becomes infected, there is no cure. E. coli 0157 infects more than 20,000 people each year, killing 500 of them. In 1993, 4 people died after eating E. coli-tainted hamburgers from the Jack in the Box fast food chain. Fully cooking hamburgers can kill the E. coli bacteria, but these burgers had not been fully cooked.
When I found out it was the strain of E. coli, and I asked him if it was the same strain that affected the kids in Jack in the Box. He said, yes, Michael has the same strain. And I said, oh my God.
When E. coli 0157 is in a widely disseminated vehicle, out in the population for general consumption, it's like a serial murderer is potentially loose in the population.
Breanne Kiner was one of the children infected with E. coli 0157 from an undercooked hamburger purchased at the Jack in the Box restaurant. She was in a coma for 6 weeks. The E. coli produces cytotoxins which kill other cells, breaking through the endothelial layer of the intestines, spilling poisons into the bloodstream. That complication is called hemolytic uremic syndrome. Although Breanne Kiner eventually came out of her coma, most of her major organs were damaged, and she'll need a kidney transplant when she's older. Michael Beverly also developed hemolytic uremic syndrome, which can cause brain damage, kidney damage, sepsis, and death. Doctors immediately placed Michael on kidney dialysis to cleanse his body of toxins.
Hemolytic uremic syndrome is life-threatening. Of all the kinds of diarrheas an otherwise healthy child can get in North America, almost none will cause a death or could cause a death, except for this one. That's why this one is so fearsome once it gets into a person.
The kidney specialist came in and he said, it's very serious and he might not pull through the night. It's up to his little body. And then that's when I just broke down. I came out and I started crying immediately. I said, this is it.
As Michael Beverly lay near death in a Seattle hospital, medical investigators were still trying to figure out how he came into contact with this deadly pathogen. As 2.5-year-old Michael Beverly lay unconscious and near death in a Seattle hospital, 12 more children were admitted to local hospitals, all diagnosed with the same deadly pathogen, E. coli 0157. Since there is no cure for E. coli 0157, investigators needed to find the source of the outbreak before even more people were infected.
My biggest concern was that the cases we were seeing every other day were just the very beginning of a much larger outbreak.
Medical investigators suspected that food was the probable source, but the E. coli might have been in one food source or many. Dr. Mansoor Samadpour's job was to see if he could identify the exact strain of E. coli that infected the children. To find out, he turned to something usually used for criminal investigations, DNA testing.
When we say E. coli 0157, it's a very large clan, very large family or tribe in the E. coli species. When we do genetic fingerprinting, we can go to the individuals in that family. So instead of saying that someone with the last name of Smith killed someone else, we can say that John Smith with social security number of such and such, living in such and such place, committed the crime.
Like human beings, a pathogen like E. coli has its own genetic fingerprint. Using what is called micro-restriction fingerprinting, the E. coli samples were placed in a buffer of restriction enzymes which break the cells open. Then, the DNA strands are cut into smaller pieces, making them easier to analyze. The fragments are placed into a gel with a dye. And after a process called electrophoresis, the genetic profile appears similar to a barcode. The results indicated that all of the E. coli strains were the same. In other words, all of the sick individuals had been infected from the same source.
We had 9 patients that had E. coli 0157s in them with the same genetic fingerprint. Definitely that shows that you have a growing outbreak.
E. coli 0157 has a long incubation period, 5 to 7 days, far longer than most foodborne illnesses. Dr. Russ Alexander's job was to figure out what was causing the outbreak. The standard method is to employ what's called a case control study. Investigators questioned all of the patients' families to find out what the victims had consumed 5 to 7 days before first developing symptoms. They also compared those answers to what others in the same family consumed who were not infected.
Our early thinking was that this was probably a meat source because that's what mostly is what it is. So we are looking for everything they've eaten and what kind of restaurants they've been to, what kind of fast food restaurants in particular.
But the initial interviews did not reveal any one food item that all had consumed.
There was something in common with these individuals that made these individuals ill. On the other hand, the preliminary interview did not produce any obvious sources of infection.
But when investigators looked more carefully over their initial results, they found a clue. One of the sick children was a vegetarian.
We had this one case that was a clear-cut case. It was a vegetarian family, and there was no chance of any meat in this particular instance. So we quickly realized we were into something else.
This time, another more detailed questionnaire was designed with meat excluded as the possible cause. The new questionnaire centered on fruits, vegetables, dairy products, and related food sources.
Not until we had gotten enough cases coming in with this extended questionnaire that we began to see something else that was in terms of the source. By the end of the week, we were already pretty sure that there was one thing that was standing out.
The second set of interviews revealed that the victims had all consumed apple juice. But with hundreds of brands on the market, investigators feared it would be difficult to find out which one. When Seattle health officials discovered that apple juice was consumed by the E. coli patients, they needed to find out which brand, and there were hundreds of brands on the market. But their next clue came from an unexpected source. In Denver, Colorado, doctors were treating a desperately ill 16-month-old girl named Anna Gimestad. Anna also had an E. coli 0157 infection, and her parents told doctors that they had been in Seattle just 1 week earlier. The Gimestads recalled feeding Anna some apple juice, a brand she preferred because of the bright rainbow colors on the label, Odwalla. The Beverly family also recalled feeding their son Michael the same brand from a neighborhood coffee shop.
This one particular Sunday, I went up and stood in line and, to order our drinks, and I saw them prepare it. And I asked them, you use Odwalla for the kids? And they go, well, yeah. So I'm like, oh.
Further investigation revealed that the other victims also consumed Odwalla apple juice 5 to 7 days before developing symptoms. The Odwalla Company manufactures and distributes juice products in 7 states and British Columbia. It's a brand known for its freshness. Most fruit juices are pasteurized, which means they're heated to a temperature high enough to kill any bacteria. But Odwalla juice was not pasteurized. The company believed that pasteurization hurt the taste of their juice. The company's mission statement read, "If it's not fresh squeezed, then it's not Odwalla." Just 9 days after the outbreak, health officials asked the Odwalla company to voluntarily remove their product from store shelves. The company complied, even though there was no conclusive proof that Odwalla was the source of the outbreak.
As you know, immediately upon hearing of the possibility of consumer health risks, we recalled our products containing apple juice. Our primary concern is for the health and welfare of our consumers.
The news that the source may have been apple juice was little relief to the Gimestad family in Evans, Colorado. 16-month-old Anna was taking a turn for the worse. Like some of the other victims, Anna developed hemolytic uremic syndrome, a complication of the E. coli infection that produces toxins that shut down the kidneys. Less than 2 weeks after Anna Gimestad consumed the Odwalla apple juice, she died. For the Beverleys, news of Anna Gimestad's death was terrifying.
Just knowing that there was a 16-month-old that died, to me, I thought he was going to die. To be frank, I said, this is it, he's going to die.
And although investigators discovered that all of the affected individuals had consumed Odwalla juice, there was no proof that the juice was the source of the outbreak. The proof, if there was any, would be in the juice itself. Thousands of bottles of Odwalla juice were tested for E. coli 0157, but the deadly pathogen could not be found. Medical investigators were starting to wonder whether they were ever going to find scientific proof that the apple juice was the source of the outbreak. All of the E. coli victims remembered drinking Odwalla apple juice shortly before getting sick. But investigators couldn't find the E. coli bacteria in any of the Odwalla juice bottles they tested. But on November 4th, 1996, at the Odwalla Distribution Center, investigators found one bottle of apple juice that tested positive for E. coli 0157. The question now was whether the bottle contained the same strain that caused the death of Anna Gimestad and infected Michael Beverly and the other children. To find out, investigators turned once again to DNA testing. The DNA profile on the left is the E. coli strain from Michael Beverly. On the right, the DNA profile of the E. coli found in the bottle of Odwalla apple juice. The profiles were identical. Scientific proof that the Odwalla juice was the source.
Being able to identify the same genetic strain of E. coli in a bottle of unopened Odwalla juice, given that an estimated 40,000 of these bottles, it's not finding a needle in a haystack, it's finding a needle out of about 100 haystacks spread across most of western United States.
The label revealed the juice had been bottled on October 7th, 1996, 3 weeks before the outbreak. Company records identified the orchard whose apples were used to make the juice that day. Dr. Sarah Cody, an epidemic intelligence officer with the California Department of Health, went to the orchard to investigate.
We were wandering in the orchard, and what we noticed was along the edge of the orchard there were a number of deer prints in the sand.
And near the deer prints were deer droppings, a potential source of E. coli 0157. Dr. Cody wondered whether some of the apples had fallen to the ground, had come into contact with the deer droppings, and then were picked up and sent to the juice processing plant. Dr. Cody collected samples which were sent to the lab for testing. The E. coli from the deer droppings was then sent for DNA testing, but it did not match the E. coli strain that infected the 13 children.
It's possible that there could have been one deer or a number of deer that were shedding one strain or more than one strain. So perhaps we just isolated the wrong strain, or perhaps we got the wrong deer, perhaps we got the wrong orchard.
The Odwalla Company says that it's against their policy to purchase apples that were picked up from the ground.
Even though Odwalla claimed to have documents, signed documents from their suppliers that they did not use ground apples or apples from the ground, we found that it's virtually impossible to verify that or to enforce it, especially when workers are paid by the bin.
And in 1996, the U.S. Army considered serving Odwalla juice to military personnel. But after an inspection of the Odwalla processing plant, military investigators stated that Odwalla's plant sanitation program does not adequately assure product wholesomeness for military consumers. The Army rated the bacteria levels in the juice as too high. A copy of the U.S. Army report found its way into the hands of the attorney representing the victims of the E. coli outbreak, William Marler.
Odwalla was trying to sell Odwalla juice to the U.S. Army. No, not as a bacteriological weapon, but the amount of bacteria that was in the finished product samples were in the millions, where any possible responsible company would have had it in the tens.
The United States Attorney General's office took the unprecedented step of indicting Odwalla in a criminal prosecution. The charge, delivering adulterated food products for interstate commerce.
And when we find a company that has knowingly placed contaminated food into the stream of commerce, we are going to prosecute that company and we are going to put the individuals in jail. And that's a very strong lesson, and it's one that the people that manufacture food in this country ought to take to heart.
In July of 1998, Odwalla pleaded guilty and was fined $1.5 million, the largest penalty ever imposed in a food poisoning case. Odwalla products are now pasteurized and carry warning labels. But for the family of 16-month-old Anna Gimestad, that was too little, too late.
There's no amount of monetary penalty or jail time that is ever going to bring back little Anna or make the other dozen or so children that were severely injured whole again. So from that standpoint, I don't think that there was a possible settlement that would have been satisfactory.
E. coli 0157 can cause serious diseases. There's other foodborne pathogens out there that can cause serious diseases. We have the technology to prevent many of these problems. The consumption of unpasteurized apple juice in the 1996 outbreak was a dramatic example of how a safe, effective technology was not employed to the detriment of children in the Northwest.
The families of the victims filed suit against Odwalla and settled with the company before going to trial. The terms of that settlement were not disclosed. Michael Beverly now appears to be in good health, but he and the other children still face the possibility of future medical complications from their E. coli 0157 infection.
What was it that almost killed Michael? It was E. coli. It was the effects of the E. coli toxin in his body, eating up his system. That's what almost killed him.
Unfortunately, I see it a little different. I see it as what almost killed him was a company's negligence and irresponsibility, and this shouldn't have happened.
The smoking gun in this case was the science. It was what the forensics gave us. Odwalla had no wiggle room. It was conclusive. It was a matter of scientific principle that Odwalla's product had E. coli 0157H7 in it, and that was the same exact bacteria which was in the victims.
On September 17, 1966, Diane Keidel met a boyfriend for a drink at a local night spot. After leaving the bar, she disappeared. Officials weren't sure whether she ran away from the responsibilities facing a single mother with 4 young children, or perhaps had been the victim of foul play. That question was answered 27 years later, when her daughter came forward with a fantastic tale of something she saw when she was 5 years old. In 1956, 21-year-old Diane Kidder went to work in her father's grocery store in Peoria, Illinois. She needed the money since she was recently divorced and was raising her 2-year-old daughter, Susie. And it was in that store one day where she met a bachelor from town, Gene Keidel.
Gene wasn't the best-looking guy in the world, but he is a good talker. He's a very good talker, and he was able to woo her.
The couple dated for a year, fell in love, and eventually married. They moved to Phoenix, Arizona, where Gene found work in the growing construction industry. Together, Gene and Diane had 3 more children, Greg, Kelly, and Lori.
My siblings and I were really close, yeah. It was a lot of great childhood memories.
Over time, Diane and Gene decided that it was best for all concerned if they divorced. On September 17th, the couple met for dinner at a nearby restaurant to discuss the final details of the property settlement and visitation. By all accounts, the meeting went well. Afterwards, Diane dropped Gene off at his apartment. From there, Diane drove to the Amber Inn, where she met Bob Marlin, a man she had been casually dating since her separation. A few hours later, Gene Keidel called Diane at the house, and when the children said she still wasn't home, he went over to babysit and fell asleep on the sofa. The next morning, Gene said he found his wife's car in the driveway, but there was no sign of her. Gene called the police department and reported her missing.
I know she arrived home, her car was there, her purse was in the house, her keys were in the house on the table in the kitchen. Diane did not take any clothes with her that we learned of, and there was no reason for her to run away. There was no motive there.
Missing persons investigators couldn't understand why Diane would have left town without her children.
Her neighbors, her mother and her brother, all indicated that Mrs. Keidel would never leave her children for any length of time. They described her as an excellent mother, very concerned about her children.
When police went to interview Bob Marlin, the man Diane was with at the bar, they were told an incredible piece of news. Bob Marlin suffered a heart attack and died the day after his date with Diane. Whatever Marlin might have known about Diane's disappearance went with him to his grave. 2 days after Diane Keidel's mysterious disappearance, Gene Keidel moved back into the family home to look after the 4 children.
My father's explanation to not only his children, but to neighbors and anybody that would inquire about my mother's sudden disappearance was that my mother had run off with a boyfriend.
Gene provided police with a list of men he said Diane had been dating since the separation, but they all were dead ends. Over time, the Keidel children adjusted to life without their mother, although they all hoped that someday she would return. But 4 months later, tragedy struck once again. Around 9 o'clock at night, while Gene was at a nearby laundromat, a fire broke out in the Keidel's home. The blaze quickly engulfed the entire house, and the 4 children were trapped in their bedrooms.
Lori, come on, wake up! Wake up, Lori, come on, there's a fire!
Susie, the oldest, led the others around the flames. But Lori ran back into her bedroom for her Winnie the Pooh stuffed animal.
I fell on the floor, I was burned, I was crying, I wanted my mother. And my older sister Susie came in, the house was ablaze around us, and so she laid on top of me. She said, they're coming for us now, Lori, they'll help us. She said, I love you, and she said, I'll never ever leave you.
Please, I love you, and I'll never ever let you go, I promise.
And at that point we died, and she held me.
Susie gave her life protecting Lori from the flames, although Lori suffered 3rd-degree burns over 50% of her body.
I was continually loved by my sister as she held me and died, protecting me. The trauma, the nightmares, the horror of it, that doesn't go away. I just try to overcome that with knowing that I was loved, that I was valuable enough to die for.
What can you say? I mean, when you see that, it takes your breath away. I mean, you realize that that person made the ultimate sacrifice.
8-year-old Kelly also died in the fire. 9-year-old Greg survived. Jean Kydell arrived at the scene just as firemen were pulling the children from the blaze. Investigators found a melted pot on the stovetop burner. The knob was in the on position. As a result, the fire was ruled accidental. After spending 4 months in a hospital burn unit, Lori went back to live in the family home her father had rebuilt after the fire. But 1 year later, there was an incident that helped Lori realize the terrible truth of what happened to her mother. It happened when Lori and her father went to a friend's funeral. His name was Michael, a boy from the neighborhood who was killed in the Vietnam War.
Daddy, when is he going to wake up?
He's not. He's dead. They're going to bury him today.
Wake him up! Wake him up!
And I began to cry, and I threw a very large distraction, a very large fit, trying to make people understand that we needed to wake Michael up, that I wasn't going to permit them to bury Michael in the ground. I was the only living person that now knew the secret of my mother.
But it took another 27 years for Lori to reveal the deep, dark family secret she had been harboring. In 1993, after Diane Kydell had been missing for 27 years, her only surviving daughter, Lori, walked into the Phoenix Police Department with a written statement. It described a terrible secret she had been too afraid to reveal.
To whom it may concern, I need to convey to authorities what I witnessed as a child. First, I must greatly impress the fear I have of my father's violent retaliation. I was often told when I was a child by my father, I brought you into this world, I can take you out.
The letter went on to say that as a 5-year-old child, Lori saw her father beat her mother to death and then bury her in the backyard. At first, Lori thought her mother was sleeping, as hibernating animals do. She said she once asked her father if she could dig a hole in the backyard to feed her mother.
As a 5-year-old, I thought my mother was sleeping. I thought that my father made my mother go to sleep. And I thought he buried my sleeping mother in the hole in the backyard. I wasn't confused on where she was. I wasn't confused on who did it. I was confused between sleeping and death.
Only after she went to her friend's funeral did she realize that her mother would never wake up. Detective Ed Reynolds at first wasn't sure what to think.
I've been lied to by some pretty good liars and have been fooled by a lot of people, and when that happens, you tell yourself, well, I'm not going to let that happen again. I'm not going to fall hook, line, and sinker for every story that comes down the pike. And in this case, though, she did seem very believable, very truthful, very sincere in what she said, but I wanted more than just a story. I wanted proof.
Lori said that her father poured a concrete patio over her mother's grave the day after he buried her. The home had long since been sold by her father, who was now remarried and living across town. Reynolds was hesitant to ask the new owners for permission to dig up their concrete patio without more evidence than a 27-year recollection.
I became very frustrated. I became angry. I thought that possibly the officials didn't believe me. I was terrified that my father would find out that I had confessed.
Reynolds looked all over the country for the technology that could look underneath the concrete patio without damaging it. The search took almost a year and led to a non-profit agency in Colorado called NecroSearch, which brings applied sciences to law enforcement. In this case, NecroSearch recommended a ground-penetrating radar system.
To take a look within the ground and to see if it's disturbed. That's what we do in geophysics. Just because we find a disturbance could be caused by many things. The proof, the substantiation is going to have to be a careful excavation.
When the radar was pulled across the cement decking, it revealed a ground disturbance 6 feet long by 2 feet wide in the corner of the patio.
The very spot on the concrete where Lori Romanek had taken me to earlier when we had walked through the backyard where she suspected the body of her mother was buried.
When police removed the concrete, they had to dig only 10 inches before making a grisly discovery, a piece of human skull. Within hours, they uncovered the rest of the remains in the shallow 2-foot grave. They also discovered a bra and a girdle. Around the skeleton's neck were women's stockings. Lori Romanek was not at all surprised.
No, I don't need any medical detectives to prove to me that that's my mother.
There was no identification on the remains, and bacteria in the shallow grave eliminated the possibility of DNA testing. Even the teeth were too badly damaged by bacteria to analyze the tooth pulp, usually a rich protected source of DNA. So detectives had to use other means to identify the skeleton. The first clue was a tree root from a neighbor's mulberry tree that had grown through the skull. The root was sent to Dr. Thomas Harlan, a dendrochronologist at the University of Arizona. By studying the age of the tree root and the manner in which it penetrated the skull, Harlan was convinced that the body was placed in the ground before the tree root. Since the root was 15 years old, the body was placed in the grave before 1978.
This will tell us the age of the tree root growing over the body means that the body had to be there before the tree root was there. Otherwise, it would have been cut, disturbed, would not have gone across. This gives a minimum age for the body to be in that position.
Forensic anthropologist Dr. Laura Fulginetti analyzed the skeletal remains and determined it was a Caucasian woman between 5'4" and 5'5" in height. The pelvic bones indicated that the woman had given birth to at least 2 children and was between 20 and 40 years of age. All were consistent with Diane Keidel. Dental x-rays are commonly used for identification. Unfortunately, Diane Keidel's dentist was no longer in practice, and her dental x-rays had been destroyed. As a last-ditch effort to identify the remains, Dr. Fulginetti decided to try a technique called skull photograph superimposition.
What you basically are doing is taking a picture of the person in life and superimposing it onto the skull of the person that you think it might have been.
Dr. Fulginetti photographed the skull in the same position and size as the photograph of Diane Keidel taken shortly before she disappeared.
A canine tooth that was slightly ajar. It just stuck out slightly from her mouth, and we were able to line that tooth up with the tooth in the photograph. I have no questions. I'm sure that it's her.
Police immediately arrested 61-year-old Gene Keidel and charged him with murder. Lori Romanek was now ready to tell a judge and jury what really happened on the night her mother disappeared. For years, Gene Keidel told family and friends that his wife Diane abandoned her children and ran off with a boyfriend. But Lori Romanek told a very different story about what happened to her mother on the night of September 17, 1966. Lori said her mother was wearing her blue double-breasted dress when she left to meet her father for dinner at a local restaurant. After dinner, Diane drove Gene home to his apartment. Later, witnesses saw Diane at the Amber Inn having drinks with a boyfriend. Around 11 p.m., Gene called the house to speak with Diane, and when he learned that she wasn't there, went over to the house to wait for her. When Diane returned home around midnight, the couple fought, waking 5-year-old Lori and her oldest sister, Susie. The two girls went to investigate.
Stop it! Go away! Just get out of this house right now. I own this house. I'll stay here.
When she saw her children, she took her defense down. And it was at that point that my father delivered her last blow. And she whipped back and hit her head and slid to the floor.
Gene saw the girls run from the hallway, and they hid in the closet. When the children eventually came out of hiding, they saw their mother's lifeless body on the pool deck, and they saw their father digging a hole in the backyard. The next day, Gene Keidel poured a fresh layer of concrete over his wife's grave for what he thought would be an eternity. Lori describes her father as an alcoholic, cruel, and violent.
We're talking about the fact that my father would beat my mother violently. My father would attempt to beat his children, my siblings and I. And when my mother was alive, she would intervene, and she would not permit my father to beat his children. She was very strong on that issue.
Lori also says that her father threatened to kill her if she ever revealed details of her mother's death.
This was something that Lori says that she never forgot. And she had just been terrified for her whole childhood and then adult life of her father, even after she got married and left the house and they barely had a relationship at some points. She remembered the thing the whole way through, and somehow, I mean, I don't think there's anyone that really could exactly describe what was going on in that head of hers all those years.
In 1995, Gene Keidel was convicted for the murder of his wife, Diane, and was sentenced to life in prison.
I think it says that the memory of a 5-year-old, even though it's some 29 years later, is sufficient to convict. But again, remember, the one unanswerable question was, if what she saw wasn't what she saw, how could she have led us to the body? And she did.
My father single-handedly murdered my mother, murdered my 2 siblings and attempted a murder on me and a murder on my brother. I think that my father will more meet his calling upon his death. I pray for my father. I think that this judicial system will have nothing in the comparison of the wrath of God. And that I'm sorry for. My father will have to answer and be held accountable. What does a man tell our Creator God when God says, what did you do to that beautiful wife and lovely children I gave you? And my father will reply, I beat them, I murdered them, I burned them up in a horrible fire. What will be my father's punishment? I'm sorry. That causes me the grief that I feel today for him.
In 1993, on an Indian reservation in the southwestern United States, young Navajo Indians were dying at an alarming rate. More than 20 people would die from the mysterious disease, one that health officials had never seen before. But the Navajo medicine men provided a critical piece of information which led investigators around the world to a most unlikely killer. Covering 25,000 square miles of high desert in 4 states, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona, is a Navajo Indian reservation in an area known as the Four Corners. It's the largest Navajo community in America, with some 1,200 members of the tribe living throughout the desert hills. The scenery brings thousands of tourists each year, a vital source of revenue for the Navajo who have inhabited the area for centuries. But poverty is endemic and was a fact of life for people like 19-year-old Merrill Bahi. But Merrill Bahi had something that set him apart.
Merrill was a very phenomenal person, but where he stood out was his running ability. And I think if you talk to anybody that saw him run, you know, they would tell you that it was a gift that he had in running, and he loved to run.
Merrill Bahi was so fast, he won a full scholarship to the Santa Fe Indian School, a boarding school that was miles away from his home, both physically and culturally.
He didn't really know how to put a sheet on a bed, or, you know, it was like he threw the blanket on and that was it. I said, no, Merle, you put this down first. So I had to show him how to make up a bed.
Bahi slowly adjusted to his new life. He did well in school, but the transition to life in the city was difficult until he met Florina Woody.
Something magical happened. He met another Navajo girl at a Pueblo school and they fell in love so intensely that the track coach decided to make Florina the manager of the track team, to hand out the towels so that Merrill would keep his mind on his running.
Not long afterwards, they had a son, Maurice, and planned to get married. But shortly after the baby was born, Florina woke up one morning with what she thought was the flu.
She was all cold. She kept, having these chills. And it was something like you're getting a cold or getting sick from a common cold.
Their lungs were a whiteout, meaning they were just solid. They should usually be dark from the air, and they obviously had something in there, fluid in there.
Doctors raced to find out what was wrong. They administered oxygen to help Florina breathe, but she went into shock.
I saw one of the nurses coming out of her room all disturbed, and she was crying, and I knew that something was happening.
None of the standard procedures worked, and Florina's heart stopped beating. The pressure on her lungs was simply too much for her body to bear. The cause of death, acute respiratory failure. Florina Woody died on Mother's Day. She was just 21 years old.
And they told us that she was gone. Then they allowed us to go into her room. I just couldn't believe that my baby is gone. I didn't want to leave her. I just want to hang out to her right there.
Doctors had no idea what had caused Florina's sudden death, and they feared that whatever killed Florina Woody might be contagious. Florina's death was a particularly cruel blow to Merrill Bahi. The mother of his infant son was dead. As Bahi prepared for Florina's funeral, he too started to develop similar symptoms.
Merrill Bahi was beside himself. He wasn't feeling well, but it didn't occur to him that it could possibly be the same thing that affected Florina.
Merrill's physical condition quickly deteriorated, and he was rushed to the Crown Point Hospital, the same hospital that treated Florina. After an initial consultation, Merrill did not want to be treated where Florina died, so his family drove him to the Indian Medical Center in Gallup, an hour away. Shortly before arrival, Merrill lost consciousness. As doctors rushed him into the emergency room, he died. The cause of death, acute respiratory failure. Merrill Bahi was only 19 years old. Ironically, Merrill died during Florina's funeral service, which was taking place directly across the street from the hospital.
The funeral was going on, and there we had a meeting with our medical investigator. Merrill's family were coming in for Flo's funeral, and they were told there, and everything just started happening here and there, and that's when I went into shock.
Health authorities had no explanation for what killed the young couple. The only way they could determine the cause was to perform a complete autopsy. But autopsies are not permitted in the Navajo community.
It's forbidden among traditional Navajos to have autopsies done, and the Navajo tribal government can forbid that if they want to, and I don't think the government people really understood that we have that sovereign power to do that, even if it's a medical emergency.
But with her daughter and future son-in-law dead, Vita Begay wanted answers. She took the unusual step of defying tradition and the tribal elders by giving doctors permission to perform the autopsies. The autopsy findings took on a new importance when Merrill and Florina's infant child, Maurice, also fell ill. He was rushed to the hospital and quarantined.
What is it? Where did it come from, or what is it? Is it gonna be here, or how? You know, I had those questions, and I wanted to find out.
As authorities awaited the autopsy results, the disease continued its deadly rampage. Within a week of Florina and Merrill's deaths, the number of dead had risen to 6, and each day, more people were being hospitalized with symptoms. New Mexico officials feared they had an epidemic on their hands, and panic gripped the region.
We were getting calls from concerned citizens and concerned physicians and concerned school administrators and concerned everybody. And that always will happen when something as dramatic as this and as frightening as this is occurring, and when you really don't have any good answers.
The autopsies on Merrill Bahi and Florina Woody answered few questions. The mystery illness could not be identified, and until it was, more people were destined to die.
Doctors in the Four Corners area are on alert to a deadly respiratory illness.
May 1993. Navajo radio stations in the Four Corners Indian Reservation broadcast an alert. Young Navajo were dying at an alarming rate, and new cases were being reported every day. So little was known that health officials were not able to tell listeners what precautions to take against the disease.
It was frightening for people who came down with a fever and cough and headache at the time. As a physician, we're sending people home who we had to accept the possibility that they could drop dead within hours of leaving the hospital.
The outbreak was now national news, and since it appeared that only Navajo were affected, it was dubbed the Navajo flu.
There was pandemonium. It's impossible to keep a string of deaths like this a secret for very long.
One possibility was bubonic plague, the dreaded Black Death that killed millions during the Middle Ages and still strikes more than 1,000 people worldwide every year. Plague symptoms, particularly the high fever, muscle pain, and fluid buildup, bore similarities to the Four Corners disease.
Bubonic plague still crops up in New Mexico from time to time, and so the state is very well equipped to do that test. And much to the chagrin of the investigators, the test was negative. It was chagrin because they still didn't know what had killed this young couple.
Another possibility was pneumonic plague, a highly contagious disease. It attacks the lungs and kills quickly, which is what happened to the Four Corners victims. Since it could be treated with large doses of antibiotics, doctors actually hoped that this was what they'd find. But the autopsies turned up something different. The capillaries of the victims had collapsed, leaving the lungs wet like large sponges. This was not consistent with pneumonic plague, and it did not resemble anything medical investigators had ever seen before.
And it was very puzzling, and it was frustrating, because you felt like, how come we're not smart enough to figure this out? You know, this shouldn't be that hard. So I haven't had that many cases at one time that I didn't understand.
Local health officials called in the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. The CDC's Special Pathogens team was sent in to look for possible causes, and they started their investigation in the trailer that Merrill Bahi and Florina Woody once called home.
We had no idea what this was. We didn't know whether it was contagious. We didn't know whether working with the tissues was going to be dangerous. We didn't know whether you could get this in the laboratory or from somebody outside in the field.
The outbreak was considered a biosafety level 4 hazard, the most lethal designation. Dressed in specially designed suits to keep them free from any contagion, CDC specialists searched the trailer and the surrounding area.
They wore something like that, you know, the astronauts that they're sending off to outer space, and you know how they dressed. They were dressed like that when they came to our place. And that was even scarier. There was fear. They scared us.
While the medical community turned to their scientific experts, the Navajo turned to their own specialists, the traditional healers or medicine men who were responsible for the health of the reservation. They said they were familiar with this disease and that it had struck before.
They were saying that this outbreak had occurred in this century in 1933 and 1918, when it was preceded by 2 years of plentiful rains and heavy winter snows in the mountains.
The tribal healers said the heavy rains had resulted in a dramatic increase in the number of mice on the reservation, and they suspected there was some connection between the large number of mice and these deaths, but they could not say what it was.
There's an old Navajo saying that I learned as a child that if a mouse ever runs over your clothing, you should burn it, and nobody ever knew what that old saying meant.
Records indicated that there were heavy rains in 1991 and 92, the 2 years preceding the current outbreak. But health officials could not find any link between the rain, the growing deer mice population, and the outbreak. Meanwhile, in what's known as the maximum containment section of the CDC labs, an area reserved for the study of the world's most dangerous germs and viruses, investigators performed an ELISA test, or enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay, on the tissue samples from the victims. When a disease strikes, the body reacts by producing antibodies, which are unique to that disease. The ELISA test can isolate those antibodies in order to compare them to the thousands of samples in the CDC files. Comparison after comparison was made, and no matches were found until the investigation took an unexpected turn, one that would take medical detectives back in time and halfway around the world. Within 6 weeks of Florina Woody and Merrill Bahi's deaths, more than 12 other young people had also died of the same mysterious disease. Investigators got a break in the case when a tourist from Iceland, after visiting the reservation, developed symptoms of the disease. Investigators now realized the outbreak was probably environmental and was not confined to the Navajo.
Unfortunately, somebody sort of identified this as a Navajo disease, which it very obviously wasn't, because we were seeing, there were other cases occurring in non-Navajos, but that was particularly offensive, I think, to people.
When CDC investigators compared the antibodies from the outbreak victims to those in their vast file of known diseases, they made a surprising discovery. The only sample that was in any way similar was one that was 40 years old. It was a sample taken from a soldier stationed in Korea in 1950. During the Korean War, more than 3,000 troops developed high fevers and kidney failure. About 400 died. Doctors called it hantavirus because it was traced back to Korea's Hantan River. That region was home to large numbers of striped field mice. Feces and urine from infected mice carried the virus. When it dried out, it became airborne and was then inhaled by the soldiers. From there, the virus attacked the kidneys. But investigators were uncertain whether this was the same as the Four Corners virus. There had never been a hantavirus reported in North America, and the Four Corners disease attacked the lungs, not the kidneys.
I had no idea what hantavirus was, and looked in my textbook, which had a very short section on it, and of course it describes a disease that occurs in Asia, which sounded nothing like what we were dealing with.
Was this the same disease? And if so, how did it travel from Korea to a North American Indian reservation? CDC investigators then remembered what they'd been told by the Navajo traditional healers.
The medicine men had said that when a remarkably wet winter was followed by the masting of the pinon trees, when the pinon trees put out an abundant supply of nuts, the rodent populations in the state began to grow. And when that happened, young Navajo died.
investigators caught and tested deer mice from the Four Corners area. They found the mice were shedding a virus with the same DNA profile as the virus found in Florina Woody and Merrill Bahi. But the DNA profile of this virus was not identical to the Korean hantavirus. Although the DNA profiles were similar, the strain from the Navajo reservation was a new one, unique to North America.
What we found when we did the comparison was that this was a new hantavirus. That is, the sequence was far enough from any other known hantavirus that we were convinced that it was a new virus. It wasn't just a minor variant on one of the old viruses.
CDC scientists and Navajo medicine men suspected the North American hantavirus had been around for centuries, but since the cases were so isolated, it had always been misdiagnosed. The Navajo made up a greater percentage of the victims only because they lived in more rural areas with large deer mice populations. In the 2 years before the outbreak, heavy spring rains created a bumper crop of pinyon nuts, a rich source of food for the growing mice population. Authorities believe that Merrill Bahi and Florina Woody inhaled the dried urine and fecal matter from the infected deer mice when they were house cleaning or digging in their garden.
In my heart, I think it was God's will that this is what was supposed to happen to both of them. And they were meant for each other, and they were meant to go together.
Health officials recommend that masks and gloves be worn when cleaning rodent droppings, and that people do everything possible to keep rodents out of their homes. They also point out that the Four Corners outbreak was identified through the wisdom of the Navajo medicine men and the scientists who were smart enough to listen.
We were discovering an old disease that traditional healers had discovered long ago. And that was I think to me, that was the most exciting thing about this whole investigation.
The Navajo, using an entirely different approach, looking at the balance of nature, were able to identify factors that led them to the same conclusion, that when rodent populations explode the way they did in the Four Corners in the spring of 1993, young Navajo died. These two very different sets of people set out on very different paths and arrived in the same place.
While on a business trip in 1986, Ed Post spent the morning jogging near his hotel in downtown St. Louis. When he returned to his hotel room, he discovered his wife dead in the bathtub. The medical examiner ruled the death was by drowning, presumably accidental. But homicide investigators weren't so sure. Ed Post met Julie Thigpen when they were both students at the University of Southern Mississippi in the 1960s. They married in 1967, had 2 daughters, and moved to New Orleans. Ed went to work in the real estate business. His outgoing personality and sophisticated manner made him a successful salesman right from the start.
I thought Ed was a good fellow. What you'd expect a real estate salesman to be, kind of relentlessly cheerful.
After a few years, Ed Post became part owner of the Wagner Truax real estate firm. Julie Post also joined the company and was very successful, selling over $1 million of real estate every year from 1982 on. In June of 1986, the Posts attended a real estate convention in St. Louis, Missouri at the Omni Hotel at Union Station. On the morning of June, it looked as if Julie Post lost her footing and grabbed the towel ring which pulled out of the wall. At the hospital, Julie Post was pronounced dead. She was 39 years old. The autopsy revealed that death was due to drowning. Ed Post immediately phoned his brother, who was a lawyer. Together, they photographed the broken towel ring and wall mount for a lawsuit against the hotel.
His brother told a policeman here in St. Louis, I'm gonna sue him for $450 million, you watch.
Ed Post was convinced that had it not been for the faulty towel ring, his wife Julie might still be alive. After Julie Post was pronounced dead, an autopsy was performed in St. Louis before the body was transported to New Orleans for burial. The autopsy found no sign of alcohol or drugs in her system. There were no skull fractures or bleeding in the brain that would have been present if the victim had been struck in the head before drowning. In short, the pathologist could find no evidence of foul play.
I was certainly not convinced that it was an accident. On the other hand, I couldn't prove that it was anything else.
On the death certificate, the manner of death was undetermined. When the St. Louis Post-Dispatch reported the news of Julie Post's death, there were some interesting reactions. D. Joyce Hayes was a prosecutor in the district attorney's office. Her husband, Gary, was a detective in the St. Louis Police Department.
Dee had just read an article about a woman who had drowned in a bathtub at the Omni Hotel, and she said, Gary, make sure you read this. It doesn't sound right to me.
We both read the article and looked at each other and said, nah, no way.
The hotel management found it hard to believe that a 120-pound woman like Julie Post could have pulled the towel ring from the wall, since the ring had been designed to withstand more than twice that weight.
We went to the two adjoining rooms, and I probably weighed close to 220 pounds at the time. With all my weight hung on to both towel rings in both rooms, and neither one of them gave. Nothing.
Ed Post told police that he and his wife had a very good relationship, but a background check of the Post's finances revealed an interesting coincidence.
We went to the insurance company, and lo and behold, I don't know, 27, 29 days prior to Julie Post's death, Ed had increased her insurance like $400,000 or $500,000. Now, this is a woman who's making in the low to mid $20,000 a year range in salary, and he's got this $600,000–700,000 life insurance policy on his wife. That's when I begin to believe maybe we have something here.
Police also discovered that Ed Post was enamored with a married woman who worked in his office. Her name was Kim Otan. On the day of Julie Post's funeral, Ed made an unusual request to Kim Otan.
Kim Otan had a twin sister, and at the time of the funeral of Julie, Ed Post said to Kim Otan, maybe when this is over you can set me up with your sister. And that seemed a most inappropriate thing to be saying, and particularly saying at the time that he's alleged to have said it.
Police were also suspicious about the way Ed Post told the story of finding his wife's body. The story never varied, almost as if it had been rehearsed. St. Louis police tape recorded those conversations.
And then when she came over the edge of the tub,
being as wet as she was in the water, then at that point, once I got her partially out of the tub, I was not prepared for what happened next, which was she literally slid out at that point.
Do you think that's because
she did hit her head on the front portion?
Do you think that's because
It's the fact that Ed Post, in his golden tongue, glib manner, came off as a non-caring person that had this alibi, who had everything down pat. I mean, he didn't change his story one iota from the first time he told it to the second time he told it.
And some of the hotel employees noticed that Ed Post was acting suspiciously on the morning of the accident. Before leaving the hotel for his morning run, Ed Post made sure that the concierge knew who he was, thanking her for a favor she did for him the day before.
I believe you're the one that told us about the botanical gardens. My wife finally had a chance to visit there yesterday. It was spectacular, really wonderful.
I'm so glad.
And the hotel doorman said that Post introduced himself by name before going out for his run.
Hello, sir. Are you enjoying your stay?
Yes, I am. Thank you. My name is Ed Post. I'm going on a run this morning. I'll be gone about 30 minutes. Watch out for me, please.
I sure will. Have a nice run.
Sure.
He made it a point to say good morning to the doorman at the hotel, say who he was and what room he was in, and that he was going to go out and jog. I mean, like, it was from the book of Who Cares? The doorman didn't care. Why would you do that?
But all of these incidents simply raised suspicions. Homicide investigators had no hard evidence that Ed Post played any role in his wife's death. Investigators decided to conduct more sophisticated tests on the broken towel ring to see if a woman Julie Post's size could have pulled it from the wall during a fall. Prosecutors in St. Louis were starting to wonder whether the death of Julie Post in the hotel bathtub was truly an accident. The autopsy did not find any evidence of foul play, so prosecutors decided to exhume Julie Post's remains for a second autopsy. She had been buried in a cemetery outside of New Orleans. The water table is so high in New Orleans that most people are buried in above-ground vaults. But Julie Post had been buried in the ground, and her body was placed in a wooden casket. Investigators feared that water damage to the body would be significant. When they opened the grave, it was almost completely filled with water. Fortunately, the foot of the casket was the part that sunk. Her head was the only part of her body that was not submerged in water.
And her head was in perfect shape. The casket had collapsed and pushed down and had flattened her nose from the pressure, but that was the only disfiguration from the collapsing of the casket. Most of the casket collapse had been at the foot end.
The pathologist who performed the second autopsy found numerous bruises that were not noted during the first autopsy. That's not unusual because some bruising continues to develop even after death. Ed Post's attorney said that the additional bruises proved nothing, that they could have been caused by the removing of her organs and bones for donation shortly after her death. But the pathologist found 2 new bruises in a critical area.
The only additional finding at the autopsy was an area of bruising that was very low, far down on the back of the head in the upper neck region, where in a normal autopsy I usually don't take the scalp down quite that far.
I'm looking at these bruises, and as far as I'm concerned, it's from a thumb and a hand. If you're holding somebody underwater, you got to hold them by the base of the neck if you're going to drown them.
Next, prosecutors turned their attention to the metal towel ring found inside the tub next to Julie Post's body. The towel ring was attached to metal studs inside the wall with 1.5-inch screws. The ring and wall mount had been designed and manufactured to withstand hundreds of pounds of force. Prosecutors hired Bolter Kelsey, an accident reconstructionist, to attempt to recreate the accident. Kelsey conducted his experiments at the Hotel Omni. in a room with an identical towel ring attached to the wall in the same way as the towel ring in Ed and Julie Post's room. And for the test, Kelsey used a woman who was the same height and weight as Julie Post. Kelsey asked the model to simulate a fall by grabbing onto the towel ring with all of her weight. Nothing happened. Then she was asked to wrench the ring back and forth. Again, nothing happened.
What we found was that doing some calculations based on what information we had on the ultimate strength of the ring, that we could not remove it, or a person couldn't remove it at that size, unless she fell about 64 feet and grabbed the towel ring as she went by. And of course, the hotel room has an 8-foot ceiling. So there's no way that that could happen.
Finally, as a last resort, Kelsey asked the model to use both hands to remove the towel ring in any way she could. After considerable effort, the ring came off.
Concept that Julie Post somehow grabbed this towel ring during a fall and pulled it off the wall was impossible. It could not physically have happened that way.
Next, prosecutors sent an identical towel ring and wall mount to Dr. William Wines, a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. Dr. Wines was asked to determine how much force was required to remove the towel ring from the wall attachment. Those tests revealed that it took between 480 and 500 pounds of force to remove it from the wall.
It was also obvious very early on the testing that those types of modes of force application, straight pulls, pulls down, clearly didn't match the evidence. The deformed towel ring, the failed towel ring, didn't look anything like the towel ring in question here.
The base plate had damage underneath the stem, and on the left side, the towel ring itself also had been damaged. Dr. Wines performed 23 different tests to reproduce the damage found on the base plate and towel ring, all without success. But on test number 24, Dr. Wines produced something very close. That test indicated that the towel ring was removed from outside the bathtub.
Our conclusion was that it was taken off the wall by someone with considerable strength, and it was, the type of action where one would grab it and pull outside the tub, and it was, and if you look at the location of it, it would be consistent, for instance, with someone like putting their foot on the edge of the tub and grabbing the towel ring and then pulling it off out toward the outside of the tub.
Prosecutors now had scientific proof that Julie Post's death was no accident. In 1986, New Orleans was going through its worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. Many local businesses were affected, and real estate was just one more casualty. Ed Post was 10% owner of the Wagner Truax real estate business and was responsible for 10% of the losses, which in 1985 and 86 were substantial. And the Post's marriage was going through a downturn of its own. Friends said that Ed and Julie fought frequently, fights which were sometimes physical. And Kim Otan, who worked with the Posts, said that Ed Post had made advances towards her in the months before Julie's death.
I think that Ed fell in love with Kim Otan. Just him being a free man wouldn't get Kim. He had to be a free man with lots of money to compete with her husband. And he hatched this plan.
Prosecutors believe that plan was in motion 1 month before Julie's death, when Ed Post increased his wife's life insurance. On June 3rd, 1986, before going out for his morning run, prosecutors believe that Post drowned his wife in the hotel bathtub. afterwards, he pulled the towel ring from the wall, not only to corroborate his cover story that Julie fell while holding onto the towel ring, but also for the money, the potential settlement from the hotel in a civil lawsuit. After the murder, Post made sure to speak with both the hotel concierge and doorman to cement his alibi.
Yes, I am, thank you. My name is Ed Post. I'm going to be going on a run this morning. Thank you.
The whole business with the towel ring, which is really what killed him, not literally, but figuratively. You know, he had to go pull that off the wall. He had to go pull that off the wall so that he could set up a lawsuit against the Omni Hotel and get more money. The greedy SOB.
3 years after Julie Post's death, Ed Post went on trial for first-degree murder. Ed Post pleaded not guilty and took the stand in his own defense.
Ed's demeanor on the stand, I think, could best be described as follows. He was very well dressed. He was very articulate, spoke at a very sophisticated level, including his use of the language, spoke, I think, far differently than the jurors were accustomed to speaking or hearing. He did not speak with a Southern accent at all, although he was from New Orleans. And he came across, as Ed often came across, as condescending. And I think that those things did not play well.
And the scientific experts provided powerful testimony that Julie Post was not capable of removing the towel ring during a fall. It took the jury less than a day to reach its verdict. Ed Post was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Ed Post and his attorneys appealed the conviction, and in a plea bargain, Post agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder and confess to the murder of his wife in exchange for a 30-year prison sentence that included the possibility of parole.
If he doesn't take the towel ring off, he gets away with it. It's just an accidental drowning. I mean, look at how it happened. Almost everybody classified it as undetermined or accidental. But for that, Ed Post would be on his merry way. He probably sued the Omni, got a couple $1 million, and had $700,000 in life insurance. We wouldn't even know who he was.
In my opinion, the most important thing in the trial was the science. It was the towel ring. When you can show that it was wrenched back and forth until it broke or until it came loose, that convicted him. If he would have left that out of there, he might be a free man today.
For 15 years, a serial rapist preyed on single women in the small college town of Lafayette, Louisiana. Although his MO was always the same, investigators had few clues to his identity. The masked assailant would break into women's homes late at night, blind them with a flashlight, and assault them at gunpoint. But when the locations of all these crimes were entered into a new computer program, police learned more about the perpetrator than they were prepared for. In August of 1995, in Lafayette, Louisiana, thousands of college students were arriving for the fall semester at the University of Louisiana. One of the students beginning her senior year was a 21-year-old woman whom we'll call Anne. Anne was working her way through school at a local health club and earned extra money by babysitting for a friend who lived in an affluent suburb not far from school.
In fact, a city official lived right across the street from this woman where I babysat. I couldn't have picked a place to feel safer. It was just a place that had American dream, no one can hurt you here, written all over it.
On August 30th, 1995, Anne's friend had to go out of town for a business trip. So Anne agreed to stay overnight with the two children. Anne put them to bed around 10 o'clock. She allowed them to stay up a little later that night since they didn't have school the next day. Afterwards, Anne started in on some of her homework.
After they were asleep, I worked on the computer a little bit, decided to get a head start on some of the assignments that I'd gotten that day. Then probably around 11 o'clock, I decided to go to bed.
Around 2 a.m., Anne awoke to find a masked intruder armed with a gun. He threatened to kill her and the children.
He shone a flashlight in my face, so I really couldn't see anything at all. He was wearing these wool gloves, some really scratchy gloves. He had a flashlight in one hand and a gun in the other.
The man wore a knit hat and a bandana over his face and forced Anne to walk through the entire house. He said he was looking for money, but took nothing of value. He found Anne's home address in her backpack and said he would track her down if she did not do exactly as she was told.
He really could kill me in just a second. So I knew that to save my life and to save the two children's lives, I had to do what he said. And so I did, and he raped me.
Later, the perpetrator led Anne to the bathroom, told her to urinate and to count to 100 before getting up. He also told her not to call the police because if she did, he said he would know about it and he would get revenge. He left without harming the children. At the hospital, a rape test kit recovered a semen sample, but no other trace evidence such as foreign hairs or fibers. Because of the flashlight, cap, and bandana, all Anne could say was that the perpetrator was an overweight white male with piercing blue eyes.
Went to school the next day following. Sat in class and felt like everyone in there was looking at me. It felt like every white male who was slightly overweight that even slightly resembled the man who had hurt me was staring at me. It felt like that must be him. Maybe that's him. So I left that class and just cried and cried. I knew that life was never going to be the same.
One of Anne's friends heard about the assault and called her with an important piece of information.
She said, I heard what happened to you, and I really want to talk to you about it. It sounded a whole lot like what happened to me. As we talked, we found out this is the same guy. Everything he did, everything he said, every movement was identical.
Anne's friend had been raped 3 years earlier, just 1 mile from where Anne was assaulted. Lafayette Police Detective Mac Gallion noticed that Anne's case was similar to other unsolved rape cases, some dating back 10 years.
I researched previous sexual assaults as far back as 1982, but I think I found some as early as 84 that were similar in MO.
If these cases were connected, Lafayette police not only had a serial rapist on the loose, but one sophisticated enough to elude police for years. To the Lafayette police, the rape of the 21-year-old college student sounded similar to a number of other unsolved rape cases, all on the south side of the city. 4 miles from where Ann was assaulted, a 32-year-old office worker living alone had also been raped. A year before that, 1 mile away, a 40-year-old hotel receptionist living alone reported a similar attack. All of the rapes were identical. The women were asleep. The perpetrator had a gun and flashlight and wore heavy woolen gloves, a bandana and knit cap. He walked the women through their homes, saying he was looking for valuables, but his motive wasn't robbery.
That type of rapist wants to go through the whole scenario of, if I'm in this room and I got to get out, where can I go? If I'm in the living room, where can I go? In any position in that house, where can I get out if I need to?
In many cases, the perpetrator ordered the women to shower afterwards, presumably to remove trace evidence such as semen, hair, and fibers. Detective Mac Gallion identified a dozen rape cases, all on the south side of the city, within a 5-mile radius, all with the same MO. In some of these cases, semen samples were collected from the victims. In others, washcloths found in the victims' homes were found to contain semen, presumably from the perpetrator. All were sent for DNA testing.
If we can't find the sample, we can't analyze the sample. And diluting a semen stain, which only takes water, is a very effective means. Unfortunately for, well, in this particular case, it wasn't effective enough.
6 of the semen samples matched. The others were inconclusive. Investigators discovered that all of the women shopped at the same grocery store, and many were members of the health club nearby. Since most of the women were single and living alone, investigators suspected that the victims had been stalked, and there were some other clues that concerned police. First was something the perpetrator said to all of the women.
He didn't say, if you went to the police with it, I'll find out about it. He said, if you go to the police, I will know about it. And the fact that he uses the phrase, I will know, tells me that he has a stronger insight to the police department.
Another clue was the way the perpetrator held the flashlight high around his head, gripping it behind the lens.
A layperson will probably point a flashlight out in front, but most professionals that use flashlights in their work sometimes hold it up like so. Including police officers, this is the way in which we usually hold our flashlights.
Since the perpetrator held his flashlight in the same way, investigators suspected he may be working in law enforcement or in a related field. Crime analyst Ronnie Smith was asked to develop a psychological profile of the rapist by studying the manner in which the crimes were committed. Smith says that by ordering the women to bathe after the rapes, the rapist was trying to do more than simply remove forensic evidence.
So it's kind of like, to make a woman clean up, it's going to be basically to get rid of the evidence. But the outcome would be is you do feel better about yourself because you're clean now and you don't have that anger towards the guy.
The rapist knew that bathing would reduce the likelihood of the victims reporting the crime. And the psychological games didn't stop there.
He gave me some warnings about making sure that the lock on the window gets fixed. Gave me all sorts of fatherly sort of advice, which was pretty disgusting after what he'd done to me, as if it were my fault that he came in and did that to me.
He's telling them, okay, this is not all my fault. Okay, if you would have done this, this, and this, you wouldn't have been a part of it. But the fact that you did leave your door unlocked or you did leave your window unlocked, this was what happened to you.
But in one case, the rapist got careless. His bandana came loose for a moment, giving the woman a glimpse of his face. From that description, a police sketch artist prepared a composite drawing, which was released to the press. Unfortunately, it did not appear to resemble anyone in the police department who had piercing blue eyes. The only other lead was from one of the rape victims, who said she saw a 10-year-old brown Ford pickup truck leaving the neighborhood immediately after she was assaulted. But there were over 12,000 brown, tan, and beige Ford pickup trucks registered in the state of Louisiana, and none were registered to an employee of the police department. Since most of the rapes occurred on the south side of town, the local press dubbed him the South Side Rapist.
The guy was good. He was very good. He planned out everything. He thought about it. He knew what to do. He handled himself well once he got in.
And if the perpetrator was a member of law enforcement, he would be very difficult to catch. In Lafayette, Louisiana, DNA testing confirmed that a serial rapist was on the loose. Police identified 12 unsolved rape cases, all with the same MO. The rapes began in 1984 and continued into the 1990s. But in 1995, after the sexual assault of the 21-year-old college student, the rapes mysteriously stopped. Police checked hundreds of leads and eliminated thousands of suspects. All were dead ends. Police were starting to wonder whether they'd ever catch the South Side Rapist and whether the perpetrator was simply too smart. But a magazine article in Police Chief magazine changed their luck. It described a new technique called geographic profiling, written by a detective inspector with the Vancouver Police Department, Kim Rossmo.
The basic theory that underlies geographic profiling is something called environmental criminology. That means that people, in regards to their non-criminal behavior, such as shopping, will engage in many activities close to their home. Same thing applies to criminals.
Lafayette Police asked Detective Rossmo to generate a geographic profile of their South Side Rapist. So Rossmo flew to Lafayette to inspect the crime scenes. First with an aerial inspection, then by visiting the crime scenes at night and also during the day. Rossmo did not believe that the grocery store or health club played any role in the selection of victims. Most of the rapes occurred in homes without window coverings, where it was easy to see inside from the street. Once back in Vancouver, Detective Rossmo entered all of his information into a computer program he developed as part of his PhD thesis in criminology, a program he calls Rigel. Rossmo designed the program after studying the relationship between hundreds of crimes and where the perpetrators lived in relation to the crimes they committed.
Then the computer assesses distances between the various crime sites and distances from the crime sites to what is really a 40,000 pixel grid covering the area where what we call the hunting area, where the crimes have taken place. For each one of those 40,000 pixels, it'll assign a probability value representing the likelihood that's where the offender lives.
When Detective Rossmo entered the locations of the 12 rape cases in Lafayette, the computer identified something important. It was a specific neighborhood just 2 miles from each of the crime scenes. According to the computer, this 1/2 square mile area was the neighborhood in which the perpetrator either lived or worked. Surprisingly, a deputy sheriff from Lafayette lived in that very neighborhood at the time the assaults took place, although he had recently moved. His name was Randy Como, a 20-year veteran of the sheriff's department who often worked on juvenile rape cases. He was divorced, had a young daughter, and was engaged to a volunteer at the local rape crisis center. During the 10 years that the rapes occurred, Como was living in the center of the area identified by the geographic profile. One of Como's friends was Sergeant Terry Regan, the officer in charge of the Southside Rapist Task Force.
You're not gonna be able to print this, but I was pissed off. We go all the way back until the mid-'80s working cases together. We visited together. I am personal friends with Randy Como.
But police needed to make sure that Randy Como was the rapist, and they needed to gather more evidence before proceeding. For that, they looked in a most unlikely place, his garbage. Lafayette police discovered that one of their own sheriff's deputies, Randy Como, was living in the neighborhood identified by the computerized geographic profile. But Como's colleagues weren't entirely convinced he was the perpetrator.
Another reason that I didn't want any of this to get out is because at the beginning I wasn't really sure that he was in fact the actual perpetrator. So I didn't want to ruin his career until we found out for sure.
At about the same time, an anonymous caller told police that Randy Como was the rapist they were looking for. Faith Moody runs the local rape crisis center and was alarmed to learn that Randy Como was a suspect.
The sense of betrayal for it being Randy Como, and I have a hard time sometimes calling him detective, was that he did work cases under the Children's Advocacy Center. He had worked cases for us as Sexual Abuse Response Center.
Since police had a DNA profile of the Southside rapist from semen samples from the victims, they wanted to gather a DNA sample from Randy Como for comparison without his knowledge. So they sterilized an ashtray and discreetly placed it in front of him at the police station during his coffee break. When Como left, the entire ashtray was sent to the forensic lab for testing. Investigators hoped that one of Como's cigarettes would contain enough of his saliva for DNA testing. First, the end of the cigarette was placed into a vial along with a chemical cocktail that dissolves everything except the epithelial cells from Como's saliva, a rich source of DNA. Then, phenol chloroform was added, which allowed the DNA to float free. In this gel-like bundle of molecules was Randy Como's genetic blueprint. That blueprint, the DNA profile, can be visualized with a test known as PCR. And when the DNA profile of the semen taken from 6 of the rape cases was compared to the DNA profile from Como's saliva, investigators had a match. Randy Como was the Southside rapist.
We were really shocked and taken aback by the fact that it was one of our own. We were very disappointed. Once he crossed that line, he was just another criminal to us.
Immediately following Como's arrest, he confessed not only to the rapes he was accused of, but to 2 other rapes the police knew nothing about, bringing the total to 14. When police searched Como's apartment, they found underwear from his victims which he kept as trophies, books on rape, and road maps of the South Side neighborhoods. Police also found a brown Ford pickup truck at Como's brother's home, 200 miles away in Shreveport, Louisiana. For close to 15 years, Como stalked his prey and used his police training to control his victims from the very outset of the assaults. But he unwittingly left an important clue, a trail that led from his crime scenes straight back to his own neighborhood. Most of his crimes happened within 2 miles of his home.
We were looking for somebody who was right under our noses all the time. somebody who had the information, somebody who knew, and probably at some point was laughing at us the whole entire time.
Even being a cop and having that inside authority, you know, you're still going to mess up, you're still going to do something wrong, and all you got to do is find that one thing wrong in each case, and you can build on that.
Randy Como pleaded guilty to 6 counts of aggravated assault and was sentenced to 6 life terms in prison.
If I could turn back time, I would never want this to happen again. It was the most awful thing in my life that could happen. But again, I chose to use this as an opportunity to learn more about myself, to appreciate the people that I have in my life, because they could be gone tomorrow. And that has given me so much more than I had before this happened.
In August of 1986, Betty Wolsifer, a 32-year-old housewife and mother, was strangled and murdered by an assailant who had broken into her home. Her husband, Dr. Glenn Wolsifer, was also strangled and knocked unconscious, but survived the attack. His younger brother, Neil, lived right across the street and was the first to arrive at the scene. A few months later, Neil Wolsifer was dead too. Some say because of what he learned about the intruder. Glenn and Betty Wolsifer had been married for 9 years. It was a romance that had begun 20 years earlier.
The family, both on Betty's side and on Glenn's side, came from very well-established, influential families within the community, very well liked by all of the community. Betty and Glenn were childhood sweethearts. They went through high school together.
Glenn Wolsifer went on to dental school, later married Betty, and after graduation, the couple returned to their hometown of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, to set up practice. The Wolsifers bought a home on Burt Street, just a few houses away from Glenn's younger brother, Neil. The two brothers were unusually close.
They were almost like twins. They very rarely did things apart. They were really big into sports, and they just grew up together like that, and they lived near each other, and they were inseparable, he and his brother.
And when Glenn and Betty gave birth to a daughter, Danielle, their life together seemed perfect. But tragedy struck. On Saturday morning, August 30th, 1986, just after dawn, Glenn Wolsifer called his younger brother Neil, telling him that an intruder had broken into his home. Neil ran across the street to Glenn's home, and when he saw that Glenn had been assaulted, Neil phoned police. When police arrived, Glenn Wolsifer was downstairs on the floor, fading in and out of consciousness. Upstairs had been ransacked. Furniture was overturned, desk drawers emptied.
One of the officers then went upstairs, found his daughter, who was still sleeping in her bedroom, 5-year-old, and then went into the Wolsifer's bedroom and found Betty laying on the floor, and she was dead at that time.
Betty Wolsifer's body was on the floor next to the bed. There were abrasions around her neck, and her face showed signs of a severe beating.
It was obvious that it was a homicide because of the marks around her neck, and you could see it was a vicious attack upon this woman.
My father had told me that Betty was murdered, and they were the specific words.
How or what had happened, I didn't know, but that just took me totally by surprise, of course. And so many things go through your head, you can't even sort them out.
It appeared that the intruder climbed a ladder to the roof over the back porch and entered through a second-story window. The window screen had been removed and placed on the roof. Glenn Wolsifer told police that he was asleep when he heard a loud noise in the back of his house around 6 a.m. He said he grabbed his gun and saw a masked intruder running down the stairs, and he followed him. The intruder surprised him from behind, strangled him with a belt, and knocked him unconscious with a blow to his head. Sometime later, when Glenn regained consciousness, he phoned his brother.
No, it's me. Get over here. I'm over here now. Come on.
Things like that just didn't happen in Wilkes-Barre. A very nice woman getting killed in her own home did not make sense to a lot of people.
Glenn Wolsifer told police that $1,300 in cash was missing from his desk in the study, and some gold and diamond jewelry and a house key were also missing. But police noticed something suspicious. The phone in the kitchen was hanging off the hook. Police wondered if the victim's brother Neil had simply forgotten to hang up the phone after calling police, or whether it was evidence of crime scene staging. The news of Betty Wolsifer's murder and the assault on her husband Glenn stunned the small industrial community of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Dr. Glenn Wolsifer was a successful dentist in town. His wife, an active volunteer for many local charities, neither had any known enemies.
They were a very popular couple. Everybody knew them. They were the pretty couple. Betty was very popular. He was kind of quiet type, but still he was a jock, good looking. And so for those reasons, everybody knew who both of them were.
Police acknowledged that there had been a number of recent burglaries in the Wolsifers' neighborhood. Since $1,300 in cash and some jewelry was missing from the Wolsifers' home, robbery was a possible motive. It appeared that the intruder used a ladder the Wolsifers stored on the side of their house to gain entrance through an open second-story window. A partial palm print was discovered on the inside of the windowsill, which did not match anyone in the family or the police. The autopsy on Betty Wolsifer was performed by Luzerne County Coroner Dr. George Hudock, who found no evidence of sexual assault. The cause of death was strangulation, which would take from 3 to 5 minutes. During that time, it was obvious to Dr. Hudock that there had been a fierce life and death struggle.
I believe that she really fought back with fury and that she inflicted some injuries on whoever assailed her.
Blue fibers and a small speck of blood found under Betty's fingernails confirmed that she had been in close contact with her killer. But Dr. Hudock noticed something unusual. Despite a severe beating, there was no blood on Betty Wolsifer's nightgown and very little blood on her face.
That was the outstanding thing that imprinted itself on my brain when we saw the body. You didn't have to be a trained forensic pathologist to recognize it. There was something suspicious there. All of the injuries to the mouth and the neck, and no blood on the face, and no blood on the clothing.
It appeared that after killing Betty Wolsifer, the killer had washed her face and changed her nightgown. Police searched for her bloody clothing in the house, the surrounding neighborhood, and the nearby Susquehanna River without success. Since the body was lying in front of the fan, time of death was difficult to gauge, but Dr. Hudock estimated that Betty Wolsifer had been murdered between 2:30 and 4:30 in the morning, 2 to 4 hours before Glenn said he heard the intruder. And there was another inconsistency. Doctors at Mercy Hospital noticed injuries on the back of Glenn Wolsifer's neck, even though he said he was strangled from behind.
It doesn't make any sense. It just could not happen that way. The only way you could get that injury to the back of your neck is if somebody pulled from the front.
Friends told investigators that Glenn often wore a gold chain around his neck.
If he was involved with a fight with his wife, where his wife would have been, say, in the bed underneath him and he was on top of her in that position, he would have sustained those type of injuries from that piece of jewelry.
That type of force would have damaged the splenius capitis muscles, two long muscles which support the head, the same injury emergency room doctors diagnosed in Glenn Wolsifer after his wife's murder. When investigators dug a little deeper into Glenn Wolsifer's dental practice, they discovered his relationship with his dental assistant was more personal than business. The two had been carrying on an affair for 5 years. She told investigators that she expected Glenn to leave his wife for her. But she realized that wouldn't happen when she discovered that Glenn was carrying on another affair with an aerobics instructor in town. From motel receipts, police learned that Glenn would sometimes have trysts with both women on the same day before going home to his wife.
Here was a man who not only had an affair and cheated on his wife, but here was a man who had an affair and cheated on his girlfriend at the same time.
And police wanted to know why Glenn's younger brother Neil failed to go upstairs to check on his brother's wife and child while he waited for the police to arrive. While on his way to the district attorney's office to answer that very question, Neil made a decision that would change the course of the investigation. When homicide investigators learned that Betty Wolsifer's body had been washed and her clothes changed after the murder, they looked a little closer at the statements Glenn and his younger brother Neil both gave to police. On the night of the murder, Glenn Wolsifer said he was out with friends at a local nightclub and drove home around 2:30. He said that he went right to bed and slept until dawn when he heard the intruder and went downstairs to investigate. But the police video taken on the morning of the murder shows that Glenn Wolsifer's car in the driveway was not covered with dew, yet his wife's car was. To help sort out the discrepancy, police called in a forensic meteorologist, Dr. Joseph Sobel, who studied the weather patterns on the night of the murder.
Dew is moisture, it's condensation that actually forms on the object we're talking about, whether it be a blade of grass or a rooftop or a car top or any object that happens to be outside during that time.
The temperature on the afternoon of the murder was 70 degrees, so the dew point temperature, the point when water in the air becomes cold enough to change from a gas to a liquid, producing dew, would have occurred when the temperature reached 50 degrees.
We know the night was clear. Surface weather observations showed us that. We know it was very cool, so that the temperature was able to drop considerably, and we know that there was little or no wind.
The temperature hit 50 degrees at 11 p.m. Glenn Wolsifer said he drove home at 2:30 in the morning, yet there was no dew on his car when police arrived at 7 a.m. If he had driven home at 2:30 in the morning, Glenn's car would have had the same amount of dew as his wife's car. The lack of dew meant that someone had driven Glenn Wolsifer's car sometime after Glenn returned home from the nightclub at 2:30, and before police arrived at 7 a.m., evaporating the dew that had been present. And the same dew points produced dew on the Wolsifer's roof, yet there were no foot or handprints in the dew on the roof when police arrived. When police looked more closely at the ladder, they discovered it had been placed up to the roof backwards, with the steps facing in the opposite direction. The partial palm print found on the windowsill could not be identified, potentially corroborating Glenn's story about an intruder. Police were also investigating what connection, if any, Glenn's younger brother Neil may have had to the murder. He was the first one to arrive at the scene and was the one that called the police. But when police arrived, the phone was off the hook hanging from the wall unit. Police were also suspicious of Neil's behavior. He admitted that he did not go upstairs to check on Glenn's wife and 5-year-old daughter Danielle before police arrived. Neil Wolsifer denied any involvement in the crime, but when asked to take a lie detector test, he refused.
A lot of people think that Neil knew everything, that when he came in the house, that Glenn told him what happened and said, "You have to help me. We have to concoct a story." There's people that even think that Neil may have been the one to knock Glenn on the head. Then there's the other school that think that Neil suspected, and he just kept putting 2 and 2 together, and things that Glenn may have said to him, and just the very thought was too much for him to bear.
Neil was asked to report to the district attorney's office for an interview.
He went past the time and he was supposed to arrive, and Gary Sworn left the room, and he came back in, and he says, Neil Wolsifer's dead. And I was shocked. I was shocked. So we found out where the accident occurred, or the incident occurred, so he went up and took a look at the scene. And it was gruesome.
He passed the courthouse. He drove about another 5 miles, and that his car swerved in front of a dump truck, and he was killed instantly.
Investigators could find no skid marks. It appeared that Neil Wolsifer intentionally turned in front of an oncoming truck. The coroner ruled the death a suicide.
It made me feel sad, the fact that somebody was involved with a crime, and because of guilt, some innocent person had to die. And when you have the death of a person, there's always so many other people that suffer. We know that joy can be shared with others, but how grief can only be endured alone.
And what Neil Wolsifer may have known about the murder went with him to his grave. With Dr. Glenn Wolsifer as the prime suspect in his wife's murder, police discovered that the all-American image he presented to the public was just that, an image. Before her death, Betty Wolsifer told friends that she knew all about her husband's affairs with the aerobics instructor and his dental assistant, and that she had had enough.
We found out from some of Betty's girlfriends that she was very annoyed with some of these things that were happening, very annoyed with him going out at nights and not coming in until all hours of the morning. And some of the girlfriends even made comments to her, well, maybe you should confront him, maybe you should ask him what's going on.
To see if there was any evidence of a physical confrontation between Glenn and his wife, FBI analyst Doug Dietrich analyzed the debris under Betty Wolsifer's fingernails. There he found a number of blue cotton denim fibers. Using microspectrophotometry, Dietrich analyzed the spectrum of color in the dye of those fibers and concluded that the dye was consistent with the dye used in the denim shirt and jeans that Glenn Wolsifer was seen wearing at the nightclub just hours before his wife's murder. Finally, Dietrich analyzed several head hairs on the bedspread next to Betty Wolsifer's body. The hairs had been forcibly removed and were compared to hair samples from Glenn Wolsifer.
From the laboratory standpoint, the hairs that were forcibly removed on the bedding were consistent with the husband. I looked at other hairs that were recovered from the bedding and from the towels, and there were no hairs out of place. I mean, the hairs that I found were consistent with people that lived in that house.
On November 5th, 1990, Glenn Wolsifer was charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors stated that on the afternoon before the murder, Glenn met his dental assistant for a sexual encounter. A few hours later, Glenn saw his other mistress at a local nightclub. He may have been hoping to have sex with her too, but her husband was there. Glenn drove home around 2:30 in the morning, and Betty may have confronted Glenn over his sexual liaisons.
What are you doing?
Do you know what time it is?
Why are you acting like that?
I'm sick and tired.
The argument turned violent. As she fought for her life, Betty pulled Glenn's hair, clutched and grabbed his shirt, and caused the injury to his neck by forcibly pulling on his jewelry. After the murder, Glenn removed his wife's bloody nightgown and washed her body in what was probably a psychological attempt to mask his guilt over what had occurred. Prosecutors believe that Glenn used his car to dispose of the bloody clothing, which evaporated the dew. When he returned, he staged the crime scene by placing the ladder up to the back of his house. But he made a mistake and propped it up backwards. He also removed the window screen and ransacked some of the rooms. The telephone receiver found off the hook was either a mistake made during the staging of the crime scene, or Neil Wolsifer simply forgot to hang up the telephone after calling police. The jury had to choose between Glenn Wolsifer's intruder story and the circumstantial case put forward by prosecutors. And amid the discrepancies in Glenn Wolsifer's story, one fact stood out. After an alleged life-and-death struggle with an intruder, neither Glenn or his brother Neil ever went upstairs to check on Betty Wolsifer or 5-year-old Danielle before the police arrived. Glenn Wolsifer was found guilty of third-degree murder and was sentenced to 8 to 20 years in prison.
The death of my sister, it's the hurt on behalf of both families, very close friends and people in the community in general, that this one person is hurt. That's devastating. That's unbelievable.
Here's a guy who just cared about himself. The only person that he ever cared about was himself. Glenn was worried about Glenn and no one else, and I think that was shown by the verdict in this case.
Benjamin Franklin once said, "3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead." That might have been true in this case had it not been for the role of science.
And when I go out to talk to people about forensic meteorology, I always talk about this case, and I go through the whole scenario and the setup, and then I ask people, okay, so where's the weather connection? You know, where does weather become involved? And usually all I get is a set of blank stares. So to think about that and to tie it in and then to go get expert corroboration, I think was really a very, very good piece of police and detective work.